Is it working?
Yep, it's good. You can go ahead and start. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Tom McGarity. Um, I'm here to tell you about a book I just completed called Pollution, Politics, and Power. It is a history of the remarkable transformation of the electric power industry that we've seen that's come about because of several forces. One, environmental regulation. That's what I started with 6 years ago when I started on the book. Two, the um, changes in economic regulation of power plants, that is public utility commissions and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Um, Three, remarkable declines in demand for electricity because of better efficiency and things brought about by things like smart meters and efficiency standards. And finally, market forces, which also have come about through the availability of other fuels, particularly, in this case, natural gas. Now, the fellow that was up before me was talking about machine learning and downloading petabytes of data and dealing with that kind of information. I was on a National Academy of Sciences panel several years ago on the integrity of scientific data. There had been a lot of problems with that, people using Photoshop and that sort of thing. But we got into, in a much bigger way, into the nature of scientific data. And one of the things we had to deal with was stewardship of data. As you download these petabytes of data, who's responsible for it? That sort of thing. And in the process, we went out to California and we talked to the chief engineer of Google. And we learned something interesting, and that is they didn't measure data in gigabytes, terabytes, petabytes. They measured it in kilowatts. And why is that? Because that's what mattered. To keep that data stored required electricity. We talk about blockchain. An enormous amount of electricity is consumed there. So we need that electricity, and the question is, can we develop that electricity? Can we make it sustainable? And that's a major question. That's why the subtitle of my book is The Struggle for Sustainable Electricity. We've seen evidence of this transformation that I've talked about. One is the decline of coal. There's no question that we are not seeing any new coal-fired power plants being built, nor are we likely to anytime in the near future. We have seen an ascent of natural gas, lots more natural gas being burned in power plants. It was too expensive to do so a decade ago or 2 decades ago. Greater role for renewables, much cheaper solar and wind power than a decade ago or 2 decades ago. As I mentioned earlier, slower growth in demand by way of being more efficient. And this has resulted, interestingly, in all of this, in lower electricity prices for the consumer. But there have been some negative impacts as well. There are, for example, fewer jobs in the electric power industry, fewer jobs in the coal industry, fewer jobs in the railroad industries that haul the coal. We've seen communities devastated by that in Appalachia and even in the West in the Powder River Basin. We've seen offsetting growth in the renewable industries, even greater than offsetting growth. But that doesn't really help the people in the communities that have been passed by and in the coal communities. And my book does spend a fair amount of time trying to say, what do we do about these communities? It's not enough to say, well, they can go build windmills in Iowa, right? They're not going to be going to Iowa, and it takes a different skill set. So we need to talk about these communities as well. And of course, we've seen a great deal of environmental improvement, largely brought about by the Environmental Protection Agency's regulations, which I tracked the struggles there over those regulations from 1970 on through until today. But over the last, from 2006 to 2016, oxides of nitrogen emissions decreased 57%. Mercury emissions, because of EPA's MATS rule, or sometimes called the Utility MAC rule, mercury emissions down 69%. Now, the Trump administration has reversed that rule. They're in the process of getting rid of it, but it's not going to matter. It's not going to matter a lot. Some coal-fired plants may extend their lifetimes a bit, but the several hundred plants that have shut down because of that rule they're not going to come back up. I call them zombie plants. We're not going to see those. That's not going to happen. For among other reasons it's still cheaper to burn natural gas. You might as well build a gas plant if you're going to do that. What are the reasons for this transformation? Well, I mentioned demand reduction through things like demand response programs. These are programs where utility companies or cities, sometimes in Austin it's the city that does it, but you manage electricity consumption during the peak hours when there's the greatest demand. Well, we agree to not use electricity so much during those peak hours. We have smart meters now. Everybody in the country should have a smart meter, and it can tell you when you're using the electricity, how much you're using. You can certainly make them tell you and what you're paying for it at this moment, so you can see how much it's costing you at any given time. We saw the dash to gas, as I mentioned. Public support for renewables is much higher in these days. Government support for renewables is high these days. It's lower in the Trump administration, but it's been high recently in the states in particular. We have renewable portfolio standards in the states. That tells a utility company so much, 15, 20, up to 50% in some states needs to be renewable. And that's a requirement coming out of the Public Utility Commission. And we've seen tax breaks for renewable power. Those are going away too at the moment. Competition and a deregulated environment has had some impact as well, as the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has deregulated wholesale markets that generators feed into to feed into the grid. There are various interchanges out there. And then, of course, environmental regulation. And the book focuses a lot on environmental regulation. EPA standards, particularly during the Obama administration, was really clamping down on power plants. But there's a less known, I think, initiative that was undertaken during the Clinton administration, started in the late 1990s. It was New Source Review Enforcement. And this is a really interesting story. The Clean Air Act says when you modify a power plant or engage in a significant modification of a power plant or any other major stationary source for that matter, you have to install the best available technology. It's like zoning laws. When you rebuild a place, you've got to now come up to the new standards, okay? Clinton administration, the Department of Justice and EPA went out and they looked and they saw a whole lot of power plants were doing a whole lot of modification and they weren't upgrading. So they went after them. And all of the major power companies were defendants in this litigation. Many of them settled during the George W. Bush administration. It went moribund, but then sprung back to life again in the Obama administration. And we had huge settlements where the companies agreed to pay billions of dollars, literally, across many power plants to install technologies, and sometimes simply agreed to retire power plants and pay big civil fines and send a lot of money into what they call supplemental environmental projects. That is, in some sense, trying to make right what they'd already done by breaking the law, offering some sort of recourse there. The environmental groups played a major role. I devote a whole chapter to the environmental groups, starting back in the 70s, but really ramping up in the late 1990s and 2000s. Michael Bloomberg gave $80 million to the Sierra Club to fight power plants, particularly coal-fired power plants. A lot of money went into that, and they fought these plants at every level. They fought it at EPA. If EPA was going to back off, they pushed them harder. They filed citizen enforcement actions. And when EPA during the Bush administration started to back off, they said, that's all well and good, but we're continuing forward with these cases. They would join the EPA cases and push them forward, joined in this particular instance by a lot of attorneys general from various states, usually downwind states like New York, Connecticut, and those states that were at risk by these power plants. So if one wanted to talk about a war on coal, I think that it would be inaccurate to have charged the Obama administration with conducting a war on coal. It was simply writing the regulations the law required and enforcing those regulations. The environmental groups really launched a war on coal. They meant to get rid of it. They stopped it, new plants from being, or they did whatever they could to stop new plants from being constructed, and then started efforts to shut down the existing plants at every level, EPA, at the courts, but at the public utility commissions, right on down to the city council. The Sierra Club was basically everywhere. Those environmental justice groups as well. Some public utility commissions, when you had this other side represented, and it hadn't really been the case before, some public utility commissions began to see the light and say, yes, we need to move more toward renewables. Now, here's an interesting point that surprised me a little bit. You look at some of the Public Utility Commission hearings, and the Sierra Club is arguing against allowing the company to put into its rate base the scrubbers, or electrostatic precipitators, or the things that EPA is requiring them to put into place. You say, why would the Sierra Club be against installing these technologies? Their point was, we shouldn't be paying for them because we should be shutting the plant down. And on occasion, that happened. So what do we do by way of trying to reach a sustainable energy future? Well, the key to sustainability, I think, is achieving production, because we're going to need that electricity. We're going to need those gigawatts for our scientific studies and various other uses. But we need to achieve those consistent with our environmental goals, and I think we can do it simultaneously. In the absence of major technological breakthroughs in the area of, say, storage of carbon dioxide, call it CCS, carbon capture and sequestration. We have some in place in a couple of power plants, but they're very expensive, and most importantly, they're very energy intensive. They can use up to 25% of the power plant's energy just to get that carbon dioxide out and into the ground. So that makes it difficult. So in absence of that, I think we do need to move away from coal. If we agree with the vast majority of scientists that climate disruption is a real problem and that carbon dioxide emissions contribute to it, we need to do this rapidly as well. End-use efficiency. We should spend a lot more effort on end-use efficiency. That's the cheapest thing we can do right there is use that electricity more efficiently. And you start talking about blockchain and what it's actually being used for, and one wonders whether that's whether there's a huge future there or not. The Department of Energy during the Obama administration promulgated energy efficiency standards for appliances, refrigerators, and lots of other energy consuming things that we use around our homes and in our industries at a phenomenal pace of about 10 per year. They were really coming out. That's shut down during the Trump administration. They are talking about moving some of them backwards, but that's not going to work because the statute actually has in it an anti-backsliding provision. But that's something, again, where we'll get the cheapest progress. We need to transform the grid. Like I say, everyone ought to have smart meters, but we ought to be hooking up the grids so that we have a national grid. Right now we have an eastern grid, a western grid, and Texas. Texas has its own grid. It's called ERCOT. We need to link them all up so that when the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing in the east, and it is in the west, you feed in the electrons here and they come out there. That's something that's doable, but it does raise issues, the most important of which is cybersecurity. It's going to be difficult to keep that secure, and the more you link up things, the greater the downside if you do get hacked. We need a new business model for power companies. Separate generation, and we're doing this, deregulation has done this to some extent. Separate generation from distribution. Distribution is still a public utility. It's still going to have to be regulated because it's a natural monopoly. Generation doesn't have to be. You can compete, particularly on national markets, and we're seeing that happen. So that the distribution companies should be a service companies. They should be providing, your local utility shouldn't be just pushing electricity on you. It should be helping you put in insulation so you don't use as much. It should be helping you use the smart meters and work with you on demand response so that you're not using the electricity when everybody else is. We need a new regulatory model, decoupling price from consumption. The standard, typical public utility model, the more you consume, the cheaper it is. You get in various blocks. We need to make it exactly the opposite. Right? We need to make it more expensive during times of peak consumption so that people have a natural incentive not to use it when you are having peak consumption. We need to set up distributed energy supplies, rooftop solar, backyard windmills, and these are supplies of energy that you can feed back into the grid and need to be compensated for that. And we're working on what just the right amount of compensation is for energy you feed back into the system, because you're going to need that system there. But we're actually working out, in San Antonio, we've got a prototype in place of a virtual grid. It doesn't have a power plant associated with it at all. It's just done through distributed power, the solar and demand response. And if it needs a little kick from outside once in a while because of weather problems or whatever, then you get it from a power plant. But you really have the system almost insulated to itself. We need to, as we bring these smart meters into our house so that it's monitoring how we're using our electricity, we have aggregators that will do it for you. They're private companies, and it'll manage your refrigerator. It'll manage your HVAC system, right? Your heating and air conditioning, so that when you're not in the house, the heater goes down. The air conditioner isn't pumping as much. But these do raise privacy concerns. And that's something we haven't really talked a lot about. And that's going to have to be done at a state level but protecting privacy, because that's data that they use and very usefully. The metadata that they draw from these smart meters, but it's also data they have about you that should be yours and not theirs to sell. So we shouldn't have them selling that data to some appliance manufacturer or something like that. Storage. That's the big one for renewables. We need to, when we have these intermittent supplies like wind, when the wind's not blowing, solar, of course, when the sun's not shining, we need to be able to store that electricity to get us across those valleys in the production of electricity. Right now, we use natural gas to do it because we can fire those things up in a matter of seconds, and we've got to have supply always equal demand. That's the interesting thing about alternating power electricity. You've got to balance it out always, just right. And storage is the solution there. We're working on it, and I'm pretty optimistic that we'll make a lot of advances, but that's where you scientists come in. You need to help us out with that. So in talking about the future, I don't think there's much of a future for coal. I think natural gas needs to be a bridge fuel, and at some point we need to be weaning ourselves from natural gas. Natural gas is said to be much cleaner than coal, and when it comes to carbon dioxide emissions, that's absolutely true. It is much cleaner, but when you look at the whole footprint, and we start seeing the methane emissions from the production of natural gas are lost in the pipes during its transportation, it gets much closer to the coal footprint, particularly now that we're learning we have so much flaring going off in the Bakken region and the Permian Basin in Texas. An enormous amount of gas just being flared. It's not a complete combustion. It's not all gone. There's still methane there. And an awful lot now we're seeing lost to just leaks. And that's fixable. And the Department of Interior, actually for developments on public lands, promulgated during the Obama administration regulations to conserve, to avoid the waste of natural gas because it's a public resource. And they had things like go out and go along those pipes with a H-nu meter or sniffer and see if you've got methane leaks and fix them if you have them, just like refineries have to do. Trump administration has repealed them. They're not in place. But that's the kind of thing we need if we're going to use natural gas as a bridge fuel. But at some point we will have to wean ourselves of that, and fairly quickly. I have suggestions in the book for making environmental regulation more effective, because I think we're going to continue to have to promulgate the regulations. We have, again, in the Obama administration, fairly weak but nevertheless substantial regulations on new sources of oil and gas development that would deal with fracking and the methane emissions from fracking. They went into effect, but the Trump administration has tried to pull them back, and they're in the process of litigating about that as we speak. But there are things like an emissions tax. That's a very efficient way to do it, though you need to be thinking about, if you're going to do it with electricity and the consumers, you need to be thinking about what about the low-income consumers, just like you need to be thinking about these communities. And I say things in the book about that. The immediate problem is to prevent the backsliding. So far, I have a chapter called The Trump Effect. So far, the backsliding hasn't had a huge effect on the electric power industry. I think it has had some effect on natural gas and the production of natural gas. So that I would hope in the future we could reach an armistice in the war, that we could recognize that coal-fired power is going away and that natural gas will have a diminishing role to play in the future, and devote some substantial resources to assisting displaced workers and rebuilding communities that have been damaged by the move away from coal. That's what I have to say about the book. It's over at the Harvard University Press booth. I'll be over there to answer questions. I can answer a few questions now. I think I've got about 5 minutes, but I'll be over there to answer questions as well. Yes?
So, of the options that you propose, you mentioned, except for having some scientific breakthroughs in production of energy, you mentioned all options but atomic energy.
Very good. I do talk about it in the book, and I got in a hurry going through this, and I failed to mention that, and I should. I think that there needs to be a future for nuclear in our as we go forward. The best thing would be fusion, of course. I think most people would agree that could provide an enormous amount of power and help solve our problems. Until that happens, we need to move to a different kind of nuclear model, not the huge power plants. There's only one new one that's being built in South Carolina, and Lord knows if it'll actually ever produce any electricity. But if we did modular nuclear power plants, smaller ones, I think that would make it probably avoid the Fukushima kinds of issues or the 3 Mile Island kind of issues. But there's one big elephant in the room when it comes to nuclear, and that's rad waste disposal. And we haven't solved that problem. That's a social problem as much as it is a technical one, in my view. Nobody wants that waste, and we keep fighting about where it's going to go, who's going to take it. Until we solve that problem, I don't see a great future for nuclear, and that's probably too bad because it does burn cleanly when it comes to greenhouse gases. I've got a question back here. I can't hear you. Right. Well, we've got one in Texas. We've got a little county in Texas that's. Well, there's some in South Carolina, but right. That's what the statute said. We had the Low-Level Rad Waste Disposal Act. I agree with you. But I will say something about the Texas. It's in a county that borders New Mexico, and it's right on the edge of New Mexico. Somebody told me that was the case in Europe too. This is apocryphal that they build their nuclear power plants on borders. But in this case, the facility we have out there, and I've studied that in some detail with regard to the fights about it. But you're right. We've got to solve the rad waste problem. Yes.
So there are potentially technical solutions to the radioactive waste, accelerator-driven systems, for example. I think there are others. Do you see any prospect for support for exploring those?
Well, if there are, we should explore them. I'm not real familiar with the accelerator idea that you're mentioning, but absolutely we should. I know that back in the old days when I was a law student, the solution was going to be, well, we'll just put it on a rocket and shoot it into the sun. There was a student in the class and said, yeah, that's right, and then you'll just pollute the sun. But the point is, of course, what happens if the rocket doesn't make it? That's the real problem with that solution, is it comes back to Earth with a whole bunch of rad waste in it.
Part of the issue is that in the United States there's no social support
Right.
for pursuing nuclear or even R&D.
Right. It does have the stigma of 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, and those sorts of things. And I still think, I'm not a huge nuclear advocate, but I really think that it's got to play a role in long term. Yes?
What do you think the scale is required of the interconnectors between the different systems?
What should be required?
What scale? Are they DC interconnects and long distance ones, or just at the edges of the system?
For now, it'll have to be at the edges of the system, I think. But at some point, I think it needs to be fully integrated. Whew. Maybe. Maybe so, just to bring storage into the picture, right? You'd have to have it DC. Yeah. Okay, well, I think my time is up. So if we have other questions, I'll be right over at the Harvard University Press booth there. And thank you so much for coming.